Greetings, sir and sirettes, and welcome back to From the Depths with me, Lathrix, and of course, welcome back to the Sandbox mode. In today's episode, we are going to be making a brand new craft for the campaign, and it's going to be something I've never made before, and the idea is a rather small water skimmer, using the hydrofoils and a lot of control blocks in order to keep the craft above the water as long as it's moving. Along with this, having very short range weapons, perhaps some harpoons, and perhaps some very small cram cannons, but most likely going with very low gauge advanced cannons. Now, I will give a warning that right now, my flu has reached its peak. My throat feels like it's closing up, and honestly, speaking is difficult. So if I am very quiet in this video, or if my voice seems to trail off, it's because I think I'm losing my voice, and it may completely go over the next few days. So, let's get started. So the base, I think, is going to be around about 4 wide. And then after that, we are going to add a series of hydrofoils. Now these will be controlled later, because both sides will have to be controlled separately in order to simply not bounce off the water and then become airborne. I am also going to have to use a little bit of lead on the bottom to hopefully centralize the vehicle, and then some PID systems in order to stop the thing rolling too much. The idea is a very fast, very cheap vehicle, which many of you will be very happy to know we could always convert later into a nuclear option. See? Told you, my voice is going, I almost just coughed all over the place trying to say that. We're going to add nukes to it in the future most likely, but for now, it's going to be standard and cheap. Well, here is the first test, and this is without any PID system. Here is just 2 control blocks using the hydrofoils to their best, and as you can see, it does stay above the waterline. But without the PID system, it's a little bit on the, well, it's a little bit rocky, although it is going at over 70 velocity already, and it's nowhere near using up how much power it's producing, so we could go significantly faster than this. And don't worry about the design currently, I'm just testing out a few ideas to make sure this build is even viable. Well, it's completely destroying my frame rate right now, but it's hard to argue with the speed of this thing, and it's actually fairly accurate in terms of direction changing, and we got to our location just fine. Yeah, I can see this working out, although I am now more tempted to turn it into a nuke carrier straight away, because honestly, this thing is going to be so difficult to control if we keep it so light, so quick, and so small. I love watching it though, because it's almost like the water is a solid surface. Time for a little bit of a test. Okay, let's pause time so we can get back up above the water. There we go. There is Bounce, currently going towards its target, all the way over there. And I'm testing 2 things. First of all, how accurate is this current system of AI? And how insane does it look? But secondly, well, if it works, you will clearly see what I'm testing as a second thing. And there we go, the nuclear explosion. Completely obliterating the enemy, or at least the vast majority. You see, sadly, nukes in this game are surprisingly underwhelming. But either way, that definitely worked as intended, and the big thing with nukes, though, is it shows itself better against far more heavily armoured opponents than this. This is because the nuke's damage is so high, it will go through essentially everything. And yes, I did just have to suppress 2 sneezes in a row there. Let's see how good my editing is. So, let's spawn in our lovely little Bounce yet again to see if we can replicate this. There we go, combat mode should be on by default. It will take a second to charge up because it is using steam engines. I will maybe change that over to regular fuel engines if I do go with a nuke-bearing weapon. The thing is as well, this only costs 3,000. So in terms of resources, even if this thing doesn't make its mark, we're really not losing all that much, and it is a rather impressive thing to see. At least the idea of a water skimmer is definitely viable. Even right now, after only 20 minutes of messing around, we've already got one that can track a target, which is pretty good. So I've been having a quick play around with different shapes, different designs, different ideas, and all sorts of changes to the AI, using the PID systems, not using the PID systems, and honestly, this is going to be quite a difficult design to get correct. It's going to have to be perfectly balanced, even when using the PID system, to have any semblance of stability whatsoever. In terms of speed, it's actually very easy to get these things going incredibly quickly, but in terms of looking graceful, well, that's likely simply not going to happen, since I'm trying not to use the PID system to regulate our altitude. Honestly, if you would like the idea of a hovercraft or something which just goes above the water or skims the water, just adding thrusters and setting them to a basic PID system would definitely be the easiest way. But this is me trying to be a bit silly. I want a craft which simply bounces off the water towards the enemy, keeps on skimming off it, but doesn't look entirely insane. So, back to the drawing board yet again. Now, one thing we could do is go down the route of being incredibly cheap, making it mostly out of wood, a little bit of light alloy, and a little bit of metal. Although, by doing this, I will likely go over my self-imposed 1000 volume. It does also mean that the cost will be significantly less. Really, we're looking for something which is cheaper than maybe 5,000. Something like that would be perfect, and that would be incredibly easy if we built it out of wood, because wood is very, very cheap. As you can see here, a single slope is 0.5 resource. It's not even a whole resource. For an entire beam, it's only 4. If we go to metal, on the other hand, it's 20, so a good 5 times more expensive. Still not exactly graceful, but my lord is this quick and incredibly cheap. So far, this contraption only costs us 1,800 resource, and all I need to do is add some side thrusters, and we could make this a nuke delivery system. Essentially, a water skimmer nuke rocket thing made of wood. It's very odd. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing right now, and I kind of want to transform this into a regular flyer. As you can see, my wishes are coming true. By simply saying it, it has happened. I am more powerful than you can possibly know. Just adding the last controls now to the turning thrusters, and then this weird wooden rocket is pretty much good to go. So I would like it to your left with this control. Okay, and go over here. Let's see what happens. Likely, we will still take off a little bit. We are far too light. Okay, that's good, and there's a massive amount of overcompensation when it comes to turning, and that's actually what we would like to see, because it means it can turn very, very rapidly. That's why I'm using the control blocks to control the thrusters, rather than the naval AI itself. This way, it's way too harsh with its controls, and that's exactly what I want, although apparently I'm not making enough power to run this thing at 100%. Still very cheap though, still only around about 2,000 resources, which means if we do use this as our suicide craft, bringing the nukes to the enemies courtesy of the Lathrixian Empire, well, it's not too bad if we lose them. If we lose several of these, but do land a decisive nuke on one of the larger enemies, we've won the battle. For only a couple of thousand resource, which is like 1/10 of any of our other craft. Well, there we go. We are now going back to our regular speed of 90 meters per second, and this is because our boiler down here, it turns out, was only on 10% power. I have no idea when this happened. I think it's when I was messing around with the automated control blocks. I may have accidentally clicked the boiler briefly when I was messing around with the power of the PID systems. Not too sure, but either way, the boiler is now on 100%. It's still a little bit weak. We still have a bit of energy requirement we're not meeting, but even so, at 90 meters per second, I wouldn't really trust this type of weird craft to go any faster. It already wants to be airborne, and that's because the thrust is actually very, very well balanced. If I were to release this thing in the air, for quite some time, it would just go straight. Well, it won't, but that's because the PID systems are forcing it back down. That's the only reason this thing right now won't just simply become airborne. It's actually very close to a thruster craft using PID systems, but it's being forced to skim along the bottom of the water. I don't know if this has any benefits over one of the hovercraft I've made in the past, things like the Shriven or the Bloodseeker, or the Bloodletter rather, but it's definitely interesting. It's interesting, it's simple, and it's kind of derpy in all the right ways. So now I'm going to add the payload somewhere to the front, and let's see if we can at least protect it, because the last thing I want is to be shot in the payload and then everyone dies. Also, shot in the payload sounds weirdly wrong. So a few people have been asking me, how do you actually set up the nuke? And there are two ways. Essentially, the first way is to just hit the enemy with the nuke. If the nuke hits the enemy and takes significant damage, it detonates, the enemy dies, everyone is happy except for the enemy. But the way I do it is once again using the automated control block very close to the front of the craft, and that's very important. And all I do is I put in fire weapons as the effect. There we are, weapon systems, fire weapons, and then I set it to go off when the enemy is within a certain range. So activate if enemy range is below, let's say 15. And the reason why the automated control block needs to be at the front is that these blocks are a little bit weird in that they don't take into account the ship they're on. They're essentially working from their current position. So if this was at the back, you would also have to take into account the entire distance of your ship, which is fine, but then it can be a little bit weird by detonating against enemies to the side or behind you, and overall just not doing quite what you would like it to do. So this is at the front, nice and simple, and then I'm going to quickly save it and then add the nuke. The nuke is now in place, which means as long as there is an enemy within 15 blocks of this control block, this will detonate, completely obliterating our own ship, which again is very cheap and only 602 blocks, and hopefully also annihilating a lot of the enemy. Okay, here we are then. So here is our naval AI, and this is how I'm setting it up. Essentially, almost everything on minimum. The main thing being that the nominal broadside angle and the broadside minimum range are both at 0. This means it will try to go directly towards the enemy, and it will try to get until it hits the enemy. Everything else you can mess around with yourself. I prefer this type of setup as it seems to just work more reliably. There are certainly a lot of merits to changing a few of the other options, but this is just me. Okay then, let's spawn in something nice and simple. So, the tank itself. I doubt we will actually be able to kill this in a single go, but either way, let's find out. Into combat mode, and there we go, going directly towards the enemy at around about 90 meters per second. We could very easily speed this up, and hopefully it will detonate upon reaching the enemy. Okay, so what did we just learn? We just learned that 15 meters is a little bit too far. We want it to be a little bit closer before it detonates, because right now, we kind of knocked out maybe 4 blocks and completely obliterated ourselves. Not really a worthwhile trade. Maybe the worst trade deal in history, in fact. But either way, that did not work out well. Also, the spike on the front of the craft may be a bit of an issue, which is a shame, because that's really helping our speed by making us so aerodynamic. Which is a thing in this game. Some people do ask me about that as well. Okay. Rebuilding it, retrying it, killing something.
Turning off.
Trying with a much lower distance, and there we go, that was better. Detonating just before impact. Okay, let's try that again then, against the tank. That seemed to work significantly better, although sadly I did have to remove the spike at the front, which does make this a lot less stable. Well, here we go again, hopefully this time working correctly and actually doing some proper damage. And there we go, destroying the enemy instantly in a single lovely nuclear strike. Yep, that was pretty darn devastating. As you can see, even the heavy armor was completely stripped clean. So well done there. And only now is it slowly descending back into the water. Okay, that works just fine then. So right now, the distance is 10 meters, and I don't have the spike. I think the spike may have actually detonated the weapon a little bit early, because upon taking damage and hitting the enemy, it may have set off the nuke, which is all well and good, but the idea of having the control block means that even if we go on top of the enemy or underneath for whatever reason, the nuke will still go off, the nuke will explode. How about doing a little bit of testing versus some of our regular ships? I think that will be a bit of fun. Now, one thing we could do in the future to make this even able to kill subs is we could add one of the control blocks to control the PID systems, in that we could have it so that we could control the pitch as to where the enemy is. So if the enemy is below us, we will swap over the pitch here from test stimulus 1 over to test stimulus 2, and then with 2 we simply have it as low as possible, thus sending us below the water, and then as soon as the enemy is once again lined up with us, it will swap back over to test stimulus 1, which wants us to go back to simply 0, wants us to go back to being completely flat, or just a little bit under that. Something to think about. Not quite sure if I'm going to do that ever, because it is quite a difficult way to deal with subs. We would also need propellers and such things, but certainly something we could do. Over there we have the MiniCorn. Over here we have our new craft, and begin. I've just also increased the engine capacity, so we are now even faster, as you can most likely tell, getting to almost 110 meters per second. Hello there. That detonated oddly light. It was definitely the control block that set it off, because it essentially bounced off the top. It is sinking the craft, but I expected a bit more. I think that was a very unfortunate glance. Let's try that again. Try number 2, with me forgetting to allow it to go to a full energy reserve, and there we go, much better. Also, radiation levels critical. We managed to take out the AI and a huge chunk of the ship. Down you go, as little bits of our floaty simply float back down. Only the butt has managed to survive. The butt will always live on. So, it's fairly obvious that these ships are going to be incredibly easy to kill, but because of their low resource count, it really doesn't matter. So right now, we have just over 8,000 worth of resource in the suicide wooden vessels, and then over here, we have one of the MiniCorn, which costs around about 25,000. If these win, it's a significant victory. Of course, we will lose them either way, but let's see if they really have any tactical worth. Pausing time to make sure it's fair. Honestly, with only 4 of these, I think you should win, MiniCorn. If you don't, it's a little bit embarrassing. Whoopsie-daisy, ignore that camera then. And there we go, the first one is being shot at, but not quite killed. Swapping target, which was a massive mistake. And the last one goes in, killing me in the process. But either way, I think it's clear that yes, there will be some worth to these ships, although I think it will be a little bit on the niche side. Yep, killed the enemy, so there we are, there we have it. A bit of a weird craft overall, not really my favourite I've ever built, but certainly a good start. Since I'm not really used to this type of craft, and I'm not really used to using the nukes much, so it's been a good journey, a good experience, a good learning experience, if nothing else. I said something earlier, which now, after doing a little bit of testing off camera for the last 10 or 15 minutes, I may wish to retract And that's about how the control blocks work in terms of enemy range, how they calculate the enemy range, because after some very small tests, it seems like it isn't always from the control block, so take that with a grain of salt. If you are making this yourself, do a little bit of testing. I may be wrong about that. It definitely applies to other things like altitude, so I assumed it also applies to this. It doesn't seem like that's always the case though, as you would think that the nuke would detonate a little bit earlier than it has been doing. It is still detonating via the control block, at least about 50% of the time. The other 50% would just ram the enemy, thus causing the detonation. But that would be far more reliable if it was coming from this block. So with that, I'm afraid I am actually all out of time for today's episode. If you have enjoyed, then of course, likes, favourites, shares, comments, all that good stuff helps out me, helps out the channel, and most importantly, shows that From the Depths is a series you wish to see continued in the future. I think this craft needs a lot of tweaking before I put it into the campaign, but I will be putting it into the campaign. It's silly, it's fun, and it's so cheap, it doesn't even matter if it does nothing, which is very, very nice indeed. And I still need to ensure that certain things I've said are actually true. It's never nice to spread too much false information here and there. I also apologise for the heavily technical video, which is this video. In the next one, we will be back in the campaign killing the enemy, unless I really wish to make a flyer, or a heavily armoured vehicle, or a mech, or something like that. Thank you again so much for watching, and goodbye. And honestly, if I do those builds, it will likely be a drunk build. I certainly need it after this one.